There are men who live ordinary lives, and then there are men whose lives become battlefields between heaven and hell. Paul was not just a man, he was a weapon, but he did not begin that way. He began as an enemy of the very truth he would later die defending. Before he became Paul, he was Saul. Before he became a voice for heaven, he was an instrument of fear. Before he became a builder of faith, he was a destroyer of hope. And yet heaven saw something in him that hell did not understand. Hell believed it could use him. Heaven knew it would transform him. This is the story of a man hell tried to silence at every step, but heaven made louder with every attack. Because when heaven chooses you, opposition does not stop you, it reveals you. Every chain becomes a microphone. Every prison becomes a pulpit. Every wound becomes a message, and Paul's life proves a truth that every believer must understand. The louder hell fights you, the more heaven intends to use you. Because hell does not attack what is weak. Hell attacks what is dangerous. And Paul was dangerous, not because of his strength, but because of his surrender, not because of his power, but because of his obedience. His story is not just history, it is a blueprint, it is a revelation. It is a warning to hell itself that when heaven chooses a vessel, nothing on earth or under the earth can silence it. Hell tried to use Paul. Before heaven transformed him, before Paul became heaven's loudest voice, he was hell's most effective weapon. He was not neutral. He was not undecided. He was not searching. He was certain. Certain that he was right, certain that he was righteous, certain that he was defending God. But certainty can be dangerous when it is built on blindness. Saul was born into privilege, into knowledge, into structure. He was educated under Gamaliel, one of the most respected teachers of Jewish law. He knew the scriptures, he memorized the words, he understood the traditions, but he did not yet understand the heart of God. Knowledge without revelation becomes arrogance, and arrogance becomes a weapon in the hands of darkness. Saul believed he was serving heaven when he was actually resisting it, and hell loves when people fight heaven while believing they are serving it, because deception is hell's most effective strategy. Hell does not always destroy you with evil. Sometimes it empowers you with false righteousness. Saul became a hunter. He hunted believers. He hunted hope. He hunted the early church. He stood there as Stephen was stoned, watching, approving, participating in silence. Acts 8:1 says, "And Saul approved of their killing him." Those words reveal something chilling. Saul was not forced. He agreed. He believed he was right. He believed he was protecting truth, but he was standing against heaven itself. And hell celebrated, because Saul was effective. He had authority, he had passion, he had influence. And passion without truth becomes destruction. He went from house to house, dragging men and women away. Imagine the fear. Imagine the sound of fists on doors. Imagine families trembling. Imagine children watching their parents taken away. Saul was the face of terror. He was the shadow believers feared. He was the storm that scattered the church. And hell believed it owned him. Hell believed it controlled him. Hell believed it would use him forever. But hell misunderstood something. Heaven had already marked him. Heaven had already chosen him. Heaven was watching. And heaven was waiting. Because heaven does not always stop you immediately. Sometimes heaven allows you to walk in blindness until the moment of revelation becomes undeniable. Saul was walking on the road to Damascus, but he was not just walking toward a city. He was walking toward an encounter that would destroy who he was and reveal who he was meant to be. Acts 9:3 says, "As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him." Suddenly. That word matters, because heaven can interrupt your life without warning. One moment you are walking in certainty. The next moment you are face to face with truth. The light did not come from earth. It came from heaven, because transformation cannot come from human effort. It must come from divine intervention. Saul fell to the ground. The hunter became the fallen. The authority became the powerless. And then he heard a voice. Not just any voice, the voice. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? This question revealed something Saul did not understand. He thought he was persecuting people, but heaven said he was persecuting Christ. Because when you attack what belongs to Christ, heaven takes it personally. Saul asked, "Who are you, Lord?" And the answer shattered his identity. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." In that moment, Saul realized everything he believed was incomplete. Everything he trusted was fragile. Everything he built his identity on was broken. And hell felt the shift. Hell felt its weapons slipping away. Hell felt control weakening, because revelation breaks chains that force never could. Saul stood up, but he could not see. The man who thought he saw clearly was now blind, because physical blindness revealed his spiritual blindness. Heaven stripped his sight to give him vision. Heaven removed his certainty to give him truth. Heaven broke him to rebuild him. For 3 days he remained blind. 3 days of silence, 3 days of darkness, 3 days of confrontation with truth. Hell tried to use Saul, but heaven transformed Paul. And that transformation terrified hell, because the man who once destroyed the church would now build it. The man who once silenced believers would now become impossible to silence. The man who once spread fear would now spread faith. Hell lost a weapon, heaven gained a warrior, and when heaven transforms you, your past does not disqualify you. It becomes proof of God's power. Because the louder your past was, the louder your testimony becomes. And hell realized too late. The man it once controlled would now become the man it could never stop. Hell tried to break Paul through suffering, but heaven turned his pain into power. Paul's transformation did not make his life easier. It made his life dangerous. Because when heaven takes ownership of a soul, hell declares war. Paul did not move from darkness into comfort. He moved from blindness into battle. The moment he began to preach the name of Jesus, the same system he once served turned against him. The same fear he once caused now surrounded him. The same hatred he once carried now hunted him. Because hell does not fear who you were. Hell fears who you have become. Acts 9:20 says, "At once he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God." At once, no hesitation, no delay, no negotiation. The man who once destroyed believers now stood beside them. The man who once silenced truth now declared it boldly, and hell could not understand it. Hell had invested in Saul. Hell had empowered Saul. Hell had used Saul. But heaven had reclaimed him, and hell does not surrender territory quietly. It retaliates. Immediately, opposition rose, suspicion rose, threats rose. Because transformation confuses people who only knew your past, they remembered Saul, the persecutor. They did not yet trust Paul, the preacher. Even believers were afraid of him. Acts 9:26 says, "They were all afraid of him, not believing that he really was a disciple." Imagine the loneliness, rejected by the world he left, distrusted by the family he joined, standing between two identities, belonging nowhere but heaven. This is the cost of transformation. Heaven accepts you instantly. Earth takes time. Hell attacks immediately. And Paul began to understand a truth that every chosen vessel must learn. Obedience isolates you before it elevates you. But isolation is not abandonment. Isolation is preparation. Because heaven was strengthening Paul for a life that would require supernatural endurance, the threats escalated quickly. The Jews plotted to kill him. The hunter became the hunted. Acts 9:23 says, "After many days had gone by, there was a conspiracy among the Jews to kill him. Hell wanted him silenced permanently. Hell wanted him erased. Hell wanted to destroy him before his voice could spread further, because hell understood something many believers do not. Paul's voice was dangerous, not because it was loud, but because it was true. Truth carries authority that hell cannot tolerate. Truth exposes darkness. Truth liberates captives. Truth weakens hell's influence. And Paul carried truth everywhere he went. So hell responded with violence. They watched the city gates day and night, waiting to kill him, but heaven intervened. Acts 9:25 says, "But his followers took him by night and lowered him in a basket through an opening in the wall." The man who once entered cities with authority now escaped cities in weakness, lowered in a basket, hidden, vulnerable. This was not humiliation. This was preservation, because heaven protects what hell tries to destroy. Heaven was not finished with Paul. This was only the beginning. Suffering followed him everywhere. In 2 Corinthians 11:24-27, Paul reveals the reality of his journey. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. This is not symbolic suffering. This is physical suffering, flesh tearing, bones breaking, blood pouring, pain screaming. Hell attacked his body. Hell attacked his safety. Hell attacked his endurance, because hell believed pain could silence him. Hell believed suffering could weaken him. Hell believed fear could stop him. But hell misunderstood Paul. Because Paul was no longer living for comfort, he was living for calling. And calling is stronger than pain. Pain speaks to the body. Calling speaks to the soul. And the soul does not surrender to suffering. Paul did not interpret suffering as defeat. He interpreted suffering as confirmation. Confirmation that he was walking in purpose. Confirmation that heaven was using him. Confirmation that hell was afraid of him. Because hell does not attack those who are ineffective. Hell attacks those who are advancing. Every beating was proof. Every wound was evidence. Every scar was a message. Heaven was amplifying him through adversity. His pain became his authority. His suffering became his credibility, because people listen differently to those who have suffered for truth. Comfort speaks softly, suffering speaks loudly, and Paul's life became impossible to ignore. In Lystra, hell escalated its attack. Acts 14:19 says, "They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city thinking he was dead." Imagine the brutality. Stones striking his body, flesh breaking, blood covering the ground, breathing slowing, vision fading. Hell believed it had finally succeeded. Hell believed it had silenced him permanently. Hell believed the voice was gone, the mission was over, the threat was eliminated. They left him there, broken, motionless, lifeless. But heaven was not finished. Verse 20 says, "But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city." He got up. Those words terrify hell. Because hell's greatest fear is not attacking you. Hell's greatest fear is you getting back up. Paul stood up in the same place hell tried to bury him. He did not run. He did not hide. He did not retreat. He returned. Because heaven had made him louder than hell's violence. Hell attacked his body. Heaven strengthened his spirit. Hell tried to destroy his voice. Heaven amplified it through survival. Survival became testimony. Testimony became power. Power became expansion. Everywhere Paul went, the gospel spread. Churches were planted. Lives were transformed. Darkness retreated. Hell's attacks were not stopping him. They were spreading him, because persecution does not stop heaven's message. It multiplies it. Every attempt to silence Paul only made his voice travel further, because heaven uses suffering as a microphone. And hell realized something terrifying. Pain could not silence Paul. Pain was making him louder. Hell locked Paul in prison, but heaven turned his chains into a platform. Hell believed that if it could not destroy Paul in the open, it could silence him in confinement. If it could not stop his voice through violence, it would bury his voice in isolation. Prison was hell's strategy to contain heaven's messenger. Because prison removes movement, prison removes audience, prison removes influence, or at least that is what hell believed. But hell did not understand that Paul's voice did not depend on freedom. His voice depended on calling. And calling does not stop when doors close. Calling becomes louder in confinement, because when heaven speaks through you, walls cannot contain the sound. In Acts 16, Paul and Silas entered Philippi, carrying truth into a region controlled by spiritual oppression. They encountered a slave girl, possessed by a spirit that allowed her owners to profit from her suffering. She followed Paul, shouting, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who are telling you the way to be saved." Even though her words were true, the spirit behind them was not from heaven. Truth spoken through darkness is still darkness, and Paul, filled with spiritual authority, turned and commanded the spirit to leave her. Immediately it obeyed, because darkness cannot resist heaven's authority. But this act of liberation created human opposition. Her owners realized their profit was gone, their income disappeared. And when darkness loses control, it retaliates. They dragged Paul and Silas before the authorities. They accused them falsely. They stirred the crowd. They created chaos, and chaos became justification for punishment. Acts 16:22-23 says, "The crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods. After they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison." Notice the escalation: public humiliation, physical suffering, then confinement. Hell wanted to break them physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Hell wanted pain to silence their faith. Hell wanted isolation to weaken their resolve. Hell wanted prison to erase their influence. They were placed in the inner cell, the deepest part, the darkest part. Their feet were fastened in stocks, their movement restricted, their bodies wounded, their future uncertain. Hell believed this was the end of their voice, because prison is designed to produce silence. Prison is designed to produce despair. Prison is designed to produce surrender, but hell made a mistake. It placed Paul in a position where heaven's power would become undeniable. Acts 16:25 says, "About midnight Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them." Midnight, the darkest hour, the hour when hope feels weakest, the hour when pain feels strongest. And yet Paul did not cry in despair. He did not curse heaven. He did not surrender to fear. He sang. This confuses hell, because hell understands pain. Hell understands fear. Hell understands despair. But hell does not understand worship in suffering. Worship in suffering is dangerous to darkness. Because worship invites heaven into environments hell believed it controlled. The prisoners listened. Because suffering followed by worship carries authority. Anyone can worship in comfort, but worship in chains reveals unbreakable faith. Worship in chains declares that circumstances do not control identity. Worship in chains announces that heaven's presence is not limited by earth's restrictions. And heaven responded. Acts 16:26 says, "Suddenly there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once all the prison doors flew open, and everyone's chains came loose." Heaven shook the prison. Heaven did not quietly unlock the door. Heaven shook the foundation, because heaven does not operate within hell's systems. Heaven disrupts them. The earthquake was not natural. It was supernatural. It was heaven announcing its authority over confinement. Every door opened. Every chain fell. Not just Paul's chains, everyone's chains. Because when heaven liberates one obedient vessel, freedom spreads to others. This is why hell fears obedient believers, because their freedom becomes contagious. The jailer woke up, terrified. He saw the doors open and assumed the prisoners had escaped. And in Roman law, this meant execution. He prepared to kill himself because he believed everything was lost. But Paul shouted, "Do not harm yourself, we are all here." This reveals something profound. Paul did not escape. Even when heaven opened the door, he stayed, because his mission was not escape. His mission was transformation. The jailer rushed in, trembling. He asked the most important question a human can ask: what must I do to be saved? This moment proves hell's failure completely. Hell imprisoned Paul to silence him, but prison became Paul's greatest pulpit. The jailer and his entire household were saved that night. Hell created the prison. Heaven created revival inside it. Hell created chains. Heaven created freedom through them. Hell created confinement. Heaven created expansion through it. Paul's chains did not silence him. His chains amplified him. And this reveals a truth every believer must understand. Hell cannot silence what heaven has authorized. Hell can restrict your movement. Hell can attack your body. Hell can isolate you physically. But hell cannot imprison heaven's voice inside you, because heaven's voice does not depend on location. It depends on obedience. And Paul remained obedient in chains. Later, Paul would be imprisoned again, this time in Rome. This time under the authority of the empire itself, this time facing execution. Hell believed it had finally contained him permanently, but even in prison, Paul wrote letters. Letters that would outlive empires, letters that would shape generations, letters that would carry heaven's truth across centuries. Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Timothy were written in confinement. Hell locked his body. Heaven released his words, and his words would travel further than his feet ever could. Philippians 1:12-13 reveals Paul's understanding. He wrote, "What has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ." Notice his perspective. He did not see prison as defeat. He saw prison as advancement. Hell thought chains would reduce his influence. Heaven used chains to expand it. Even the palace guard heard the gospel. Even those assigned to control him encountered truth. Hell placed him among soldiers. Heaven turned soldiers into listeners. Hell confined him physically. Heaven expanded him spiritually. And Paul's voice became unstoppable. Because when heaven decides to make you louder, hell's chains become heaven's instruments. Hell sent a thorn to weaken Paul, but heaven turned weakness into authority. If prison could not silence Paul, hell would attempt something more subtle, something less visible, something internal. Because when external attacks fail, darkness often shifts to internal pressure. It tries to exhaust you from within. It tries to wear you down slowly. It tries to create a weakness that whispers doubt instead of shouting fear. And Paul faced something mysterious, something persistent, something painful that he described as a thorn in the flesh. In 2 Corinthians 12:7 he writes, "Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me." Notice the language. A messenger of Satan, not a random discomfort, not a minor inconvenience. A torment, a persistent affliction, something that stayed, something that did not disappear after prayer number 1, something that did not vanish after fasting or faith declarations. This was not momentary suffering. This was ongoing pressure. And this is where hell believed it had found its opportunity, because if it could not kill Paul, perhaps it could slowly drain him. If it could not silence his voice publicly, perhaps it could weaken his confidence privately. If it could not stop his mission outwardly, perhaps it could discourage him inwardly. The thorn was not described in detail. Some believe it was physical illness. Some believe it was recurring persecution. Some believe it was spiritual oppression. But the exact nature does not matter. What matters is this: it was painful and it stayed. And Paul did what any believer would do. He prayed. He did not ignore it. He did not deny it. He brought it before heaven. Verse 8 says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. He pleaded, not casually, not politely, pleaded, because pain has a way of making prayers desperate. Pain makes you honest. Pain strips away spiritual performance and forces authenticity. Paul, the apostle, the miracle worker, the church planter, the survivor of stonings and prisons, pleaded. And heaven's response was not what he expected. Verse 9 says, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.'" Heaven did not remove the thorn. Heaven reframed it. This is where hell lost again, because hell intended the thorn to weaken Paul, but heaven used the thorn to deepen Paul. Hell intended the thorn to discourage him. Heaven used the thorn to humble him. Hell intended the thorn to create limitation. Heaven used the thorn to reveal dependence. And dependence is dangerous to darkness, because self-sufficiency can be attacked. But grace sufficiency cannot be defeated. Heaven declared something eternal. Power is perfected in weakness, not in strength, not in control, not in dominance, in weakness. This contradicts human logic. The world respects strength. The world admires dominance. The world celebrates independence. But heaven operates differently. Heaven's power flows most freely through surrendered vessels. And weakness creates surrender. Weakness forces reliance. Weakness exposes humanity, and humanity submitted to heaven becomes authority. Paul's response reveals transformation at its deepest level. He writes, "Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." This is radical. He did not resent the weakness. He embraced it. He did not hide the limitation, he announced it, because he understood something powerful. The thorn kept him aligned. Without the thorn, pride might have grown. Without the thorn, self-glory might have emerged. Without the thorn, Paul might have trusted his own strength. And self-trust weakens spiritual authority. The thorn became protection. The torment became alignment. The limitation became safeguard. Hell tried to plant a weakness. Heaven turned it into stability. And Paul continued, "That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties." Delight. That word is dangerous to darkness, because when suffering no longer controls your identity, hell loses leverage. When insults no longer define you, hell loses influence. When hardship no longer discourages you, hell loses intimidation. Paul understood something that many believers struggle to accept. Weakness is not disqualification. Weakness is invitation. Invitation for grace to move. Invitation for power to manifest. Invitation for heaven to be visible through human fragility. Hell wants you ashamed of your weakness. Heaven wants you surrendered in it, because shame isolates. Surrender invites grace, and grace empowers. Paul concluded with a statement that echoes across generations. "For when I am weak, then I am strong." This is not motivational language. This is spiritual revelation. Strength born from weakness cannot be destroyed by external force, because its source is not human, its source is divine. And divine strength does not depend on circumstance, it depends on connection. The thorn remained, but so did Paul's calling. The pain continued, but so did the mission. The pressure stayed, but so did the power. And hell realized something terrifying. The more it tried to weaken Paul, the more heaven strengthened him, because heaven does not eliminate every struggle. Sometimes heaven sustains you through it to reveal that its grace is greater than the struggle itself. Paul's authority did not come from perfection, it came from perseverance, it came from dependence, it came from weakness embraced rather than denied. And that kind of authority cannot be silenced, because it does not rely on appearance. It relies on grace. Hell tried to plant a thorn to silence him quietly, but heaven turned that thorn into testimony, and testimony is louder than torment. Hell tried to kill Paul, but heaven made his voice eternal in the end. Hell returned to its oldest strategy. When deception failed, when suffering failed, when prison failed, when weakness failed, hell turned to death, because death appears final. Death appears permanent. Death appears silent. Hell believed that if it could not stop Paul through fear, it would stop him through execution. Because death has silenced countless voices throughout history. Kings have died, empires have fallen, armies have vanished, and hell believed Paul would become just another voice buried in time. But hell misunderstood something eternal. Paul's voice did not belong to earth. It belonged to heaven, and heaven's voice cannot be buried. By the time Paul reached Rome for the final time, he was no longer just a preacher. He was a threat to darkness at the highest level. His message had spread across regions. His words had transformed cities. His influence had penetrated systems. Even in chains, his presence carried authority. Even in confinement, his voice carried freedom, and hell knew something had to be done. Paul was imprisoned under Roman authority. This was not just a religious conflict anymore. This was imperial attention. Rome did not tolerate threats to its control. And Paul preached a kingdom greater than Rome, a king greater than Caesar, a truth greater than law. And that truth terrified darkness. Because earthly power fears eternal authority. In his final imprisonment, Paul understood what was coming. He was not blind to his fate. He was not hoping for escape. He was not negotiating survival. He was preparing for departure. In 2 Timothy 4:6-7, Paul writes words that carry the weight of eternity. For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time for my departure is near. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Notice his words carefully. He did not say he was being destroyed. He said he was being poured out, because destruction is loss, but offering is purpose. Hell saw execution. Heaven saw completion. Hell saw ending. Heaven saw fulfillment. Paul did not define his life by survival. He defined his life by obedience. Survival is temporary. Obedience is eternal. He said, I have fought the good fight. This reveals the reality of his journey. His life was war, not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual darkness, against fear, against opposition, against systems designed to silence truth. And he fought, not with weapons, not with armies, but with faith, with endurance, with obedience. He said, I have finished the race. This is victory language, not defeat language, because finishing is success. Finishing is fulfillment. Finishing is completion. Hell could not stop him mid-race. Hell could not force him to quit. Hell could not make him surrender. He finished, and then he said, I have kept the faith. This is perhaps the most powerful statement of all, because circumstances tried to break him, pain tried to weaken him, prison tried to isolate him, opposition tried to intimidate him, but his faith remained intact. Hell failed to corrupt him. Hell failed to silence him spiritually. And hell knew what came next: execution. According to historical records, Paul was sentenced to death by beheading under Emperor Nero. The blade that ended his earthly life was meant to end his influence forever. Hell believed the sword would silence him. Hell believed the grave would contain him. Hell believed his voice would fade into memory, but hell underestimated heaven's strategy. Because heaven had already ensured Paul's voice would never die. His letters survived, his words spread, his testimony multiplied. Every prison letter became scripture. Every moment of obedience became eternal record. Every act of faith became generational influence. Paul's physical voice stopped, but his spiritual voice became louder than ever. Because heaven does not measure influence by lifespan. Heaven measures influence by obedience. Paul's death was not defeat. It was release. Release from earth into eternity. Release from battle into reward. Release from suffering into glory. And heaven honored him. In 2 Timothy 4:8 he writes, "Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day." Hell offered him death. Heaven offered him a crown. Hell offered him silence. Heaven offered him eternal honor. Hell offered him an ending. Heaven offered him eternity. And his voice continues to speak. His letters are still read. His testimony still strengthens believers. His endurance still exposes hell's failure, because hell cannot silence what heaven has eternalized. Paul's life proves a truth every believer must understand. Your obedience echoes beyond your lifetime. Your faith speaks beyond your breath. Your surrender creates influence beyond your existence. Hell may attack your body. Hell may attack your circumstances. Hell may attack your comfort. But hell cannot destroy what heaven has made eternal. Paul's execution was not hell's victory. It was heaven's declaration. A declaration that faith cannot be executed. Truth cannot be buried. Calling cannot be erased. Because when heaven makes you louder, even death becomes a doorway to greater influence. Hell tried to silence Paul, but heaven made him eternal.